Henry George, Daily Devotional number 22, coming at you. We left off in chapter 4, the maintenance of labor. Nope, we left off in chapter 5. We are in chapter 5. We're done about the maintenance of labor not being drawn from capital. We're on, I don't know what we're on. The real functions of capital. We're in the real plane. A plus BI. We left off after talking about moving through miles of pipe. Here we go. But to say that capital may limit the form of industry or the productiveness of industry is a very different thing from saying that capital limits industry. For the dictum of the current political economy that, quote, capital limits industry, end quote, means not that capital limits the form of labor or the productiveness of labor, but that it limits the exertion of labor. This proposition derives its plausibility from the assumption that capital supplies labor with materials and maintenance, an assumption that we have seen to be unfounded, and which is indeed transparently preposterous the moment it is remembered that capital is produced by labor, and hence that there must be labor before there can be capital. What came first, the capital or the laborer? And the answer is the laborer. That was not from Progress and Poverty. That was my own contribution. Let's continue with George. Capital may limit the form of industry and the productiveness of industry, but this is not to say that there could be no industry without capital any more than it is to say that without the power loom there could be no weaving, without the sewing machine no sewing, no cultivation without the plow, or that in a community of one like that of Robinson Crusoe there could be no labor because there could be no exchange. For all of the Zoomers in the chat, Robinson Crusoe is the story of a man marooned on an island. For all the Zoomers in the chat who don't know what marooned is, that means being put on an island alone. And he survived. For all of the millennials in the chat, it's like Castaway with Tom Hanks. We continue with George. And to say that capital may limit the form and productiveness of industry is a different thing from saying that capital does. For the cases in which it can be truly said that the form or productiveness of the industry of a community is limited by its capital will, I think, appear upon examination to be more theoretical than real. It is evident that in such a country as Mexico or Tunis, the larger and more general use of capital would greatly change the forms of industry and enormously increase its productiveness. And it is often said of such countries that they need capital for the development of their resources. But is there not something back of this, a want which includes the want of capital? Is it not the rapacity and abuses of government, the insecurity of property, the ignorance and prejudice of the people that prevent the accumulation and use of capital? Is not the real limitation in these things, and not in the want of capital, which would not be used even if placed there? It's presuming a lot, but I tend to believe it. We can, of course, kind of like when you give aid to a country that's dominated by warlords or strongmen or whatever, they just use that aid to enrich themselves, because a warlord or whatever, a tyrant, still needs their population to stay alive. And if they don't have to spend any of their own resources feeding their people, but then aid comes in, foreign aid comes in, then the tyrant doesn't even need to feed his own people anymore. I don't know. I'm not an international peacemaker yet. We can, of course, imagine a community in which the want of capital would be the only obstacle to an increased productiveness of labor, but it is only by imagining a conjunction of conditions that seldom, if ever, occurs except by accident or a passing phase. But again, that's only an increased productiveness of labor, not labor unto its not labor alone. A community in which capital has been swept away by war, conflagration, or convulsion of nature, and possibly a community composed of civilized people just settled in a new land. Maybe colonists on Mars, we could imagine being in this kind of a situation that absolutely require capital, seem to me to furnish the only examples. Yet how quickly the capital habitually used is reproduced in a community that has been swept by war has long been noticed, while the rapid production of the capital it can or is disposed to use is equally noticeable in the case of a new community. I am unable to think of any other than such rare and passing conditions in which the productiveness of labor is really limited by the want of capital. For although there may be, in a community of individuals who from want of capital cannot apply their labor as efficiently as they would, yet so long as there is a sufficiency of capital in the community at large, the real limitation is not the want of capital, but the want of its proper distribution. If bad government rob the laborer of his capital, if unjust laws take from the producer the wealth with which he would assist production, and hand it over to those who are mere pensioners upon industry, the real limitation to the effectiveness of labor is in misgovernment, and not in want of capital. And so of ignorance or custom or other conditions which prevent the use of capital. And so also of ignorance or custom or other conditions which prevent the use of capital. It is they, not the want of capital, that really constitute the limitation. To give a circular saw to a Terra del Fuegan, a locomotive to a Bedouin Arab, or a sewing machine to a flathead squaw would not be to add to the efficiency of their labor. Oh, Scrubbles in the chat wants a locomotive. How you wouldn't be able to use the locomotive, Scrubbles? You don't have a train track. You don't have the capacity to run it by yourself. I don't know. Not okay. This flathead squaw would not. So if you were to give the saw to the Terra del Fuego, locomotive to the Arab, sewing machine to the squaw, would not be to add to the efficiency of their labor. Neither does it seem possible by giving anything else to add to their capital. For any wealth beyond what they had been accustomed to use as capital would be consumed or suffered to waste. It is not the want of seeds and tools that keeps the Apache and the Sioux from cultivating the soil. If provided with seeds and tools, they would not use them productively unless at the same time restrained from wandering and taught to cultivate the soil. If all the capital of a London were given them, I think that should be if all the capital of London were given them in their present condition, it would simply cease to be capital, for they would only use productively such infinitesimal parts as might assist in the chase, and would not even use that until all the edible part of the stock thus showered upon them had been consumed. Yet such capital as they do want, they manage to acquire, and in some forms in spite of the greatest difficulties. These wild tribes hunt and fight with the best weapons that American and English factories produce, keeping up with the latest improvements. It is only as they became civilized that they would care for such other capital as the civilized state requires, or that it would be of any use to them. In the reign of George IV, Scrubble says, Max, you're polluting the audiobook read by responding to chat. Scrubble says, I think capital of a London is valid. They're using a London as a unit of measure of capital. Well, these are cool. In the reign of George IV, some returning missionaries took with them to England a New Zealand chief called Hongi. Hongi? I don't know. His noble appearance and beautiful tattooing attracted much attention, and when about to return to his people he was presented by the monarch and some of the religious societies with a considerable stock of tools, agricultural instruments, and seeds. The grateful New Zealander did use this capital in the production of food, but it was in a manner of which his English entertainers little dreamed. In Sydney, on his way back, he exchanged it all for arms and ammunition, with which, on getting home, he began war against another tribe with such success that on the first battlefield 300 of his prisoners were cooked and eaten. Hongi, having preluded the main repast by scooping out and swallowing the eyes and sucking the warm blood of his mortally wounded adversary, the opposing chief. I don't know what this preluded word means. Is that a real word? This comes from a book by Reverend Richard Taylor, published in 1855 in London, called New Zealand and Its Inhabitants. I'm looking up the word preluded. Oh, like a prelude. Yes. It's like, yeah. Okay. But now that their once constant wars have ceased and the remnant of the Maoris have largely adopted European habits, there are among them many who have and use considerable amounts of capital. Scrubbles also wants the arms and ammunition. We're learning a lot here about Scrubbles. Likewise, it would be a mistake to attribute the simple modes of production and exchange which are resorted to in new communities solely to a want of capital. These modes, which require little capital, are in themselves rude and inefficient. But when the conditions of such communities are considered, they will be found in reality the most effective. A great factory with all the latest improvements is the most efficient instrument that has yet been devised for turning wool or cotton into cloth, but only so where large quantities are to be made. The cloth Excuse me. I recently learned a bunch of our clothes are all made from oil. All of our synthetic materials, which I guess when you think about it, duh. Because what else has it been, plastic or whatever. The cloth required for a little village could be made with far less labor by the spinning wheel and hand loom. A perfecting press will for each man required, I guess that's a thing, a perfecting press will for each man required print many thousand impressions, while a man and a boy would be printing 100 with a Stanhope or Franklin press. Yet, to work off the small edition of a country newspaper, the old-fashioned press is by far the most efficient machine. To carry occasionally 2 or 3 passengers, a canoe is a better instrument than a steamboat. A few sacks of flour can be transported with less expenditure of labor by a pack-horse than by a railroad train. To put a great stock of goods into a crossroads store in the backwoods would be but to waste capital. And generally it will be found that the rude devices of production and exchange, which obtain among the sparse populations of new countries, result not so much from the want of capital as from inability to profitably employ it. Ooh, Scrubbles makes a good analogy. What about in game dev? Is a small game better made in Game Maker than in Unity Engine? Leave your answer. Game devs, respond in the chat or in the comments. We continue with Oh, no, we're way over. That's it. That's where we're ending it. Yeah, Which, one little comment, which is basically denser living, higher network effects enable certain capital to be of great benefit, which connects with when you talk about the modern application of Georgism and what's most valuable in land these days is not its ability to grow crops or provide, space for cattle or something. It's about being in the heart of a city to access lots and lots of people, typically. All right, bye-bye.